The chamber was still, heavy with the kind of silence that feels alive. Every eye followed Jasmine Crockett as she leaned forward, her hands steady on the desk. Her gaze locked onto Clarence Thomas. For a heartbeat, time stalled. The marble walls seemed to hold their breath. Thomas shifted slightly, as if expecting the usual deference that had insulated him for decades. But tonight was different. Crockett's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Low, firm, deliberate. "Justice Thomas," she began, each syllable measured. "Do you believe the rules apply to you? Or only to the rest of us?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed across the room. Thomas blinked hard, his composure slipping for the briefest instant, a flicker of unease breaking through the mask of superiority. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. A single cough from the gallery sounded louder than it should have, as if the walls themselves were amplifying the moment. Thomas shifted again, lips tightening into a thin, forced smile. He tried to muster that old posture of untouchable authority, but Crockett did not relent. Her presence filled the room. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was carrying the voices of millions, the voices of people told to stay quiet, told to accept, told that power could not be challenged. "Because from where I sit," she continued, her tone rising with an undercurrent of steel, "this looks less like justice and more like privilege dressed in robes." The crowd erupted, audible gasps, a few muffled shouts of agreement, even a ripple of applause before the gavel slammed for order. The eruption was brief but undeniable. Crockett had cracked the dam. Thomas looked rattled, but Crockett's eyes never left his. She had him exactly where she wanted him, exposed, unprepared, stripped of the comfort that comes with unquestioned power. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with expectation. Now it buzzed with electricity, anticipation, danger. Every person in the chamber could feel it. Something irreversible had begun. And yet, as powerful as this opening blow had been, no one in that room, not the crowd, not the press, not even Crockett herself, could have predicted how the next few minutes would flip the tables completely. What made Crockett's words land so hard wasn't just the sting of the accusation. It was the timing. Clarence Thomas was not a man without baggage. For months, even years, questions had been swirling around him. Lavish gifts from billionaires, ethical clouds darkening the very bench he sat upon, and whispers that the scales of justice had tilted in ways the founders never imagined. The Supreme Court, once cloaked in mythic reverence, now stood exposed, its cracks visible to anyone willing to look. And here in this chamber, Jasmine Crockett dared not only to look but to say it aloud. The stakes could not have been higher. Thomas wasn't just a judge. He was an institution. The stakes could not have been higher. Thomas wasn't just a judge. He was an institution. He was one of the longest-serving justices in modern history, a man whose rulings had shaped the lives of generations. His seat was insulated by lifetime appointment, fortified by decades of deference. Challenging him was like shouting into a storm. Most voices drowned, ignored, forgotten, but Crockett's voice was different. Why? Because she wasn't merely confronting one man. She was confronting the very idea that power is untouchable. To progressives across the nation, the chamber wasn't just a room, it was a stage. Every word would echo beyond these walls, out into living rooms, classrooms, community centers. This was about America itself, whether the rules applied equally, whether justice still meant something more than privilege wrapped in black robes. The silence after her words wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation. The crowd sensed it. The reporters scribbling at breakneck speed sensed it. Even Thomas, though he would never admit it, sensed it. But what made this moment so dangerous for him and so thrilling for her supporters was that Crockett's opening wasn't her strongest card. It was only the beginning. She had come prepared, armed with facts, timelines, and contradictions sharp enough to pierce even the thickest armor of judicial ego. The air grew heavier as Crockett straightened her shoulders. Around her, young staffers leaned forward. Somewhere in the gallery, someone whispered, "She's going there." Because this wasn't about scoring a headline or trending clip, though those would come. This was about accountability. This was about dignity for the countless Americans who had been dismissed, overruled, or outright silenced by systems stacked against them. Crockett knew that every second of hesitation, every dodge or smirk from Thomas, would only strengthen her case. And so she set the trap, not with volume, not with anger, but with precision. Each question would be a brick, each fact a hammer. Each moment designed to remind Clarence Thomas and the country that no robe, No title, no lifetime appointment could shield a man from truth. The gavel slammed again, demanding order. But order was gone. Something larger had entered the chamber. The raw, uncontainable force of accountability. What happened next would not only challenge Clarence Thomas, it would challenge the very foundation of silence that had protected men like him for decades. Thomas was never just another judge. He was a man who had risen from humble beginnings in Pinpoint, Georgia, only to become one of the most polarizing figures in American legal history. For years, his story was framed as one of triumph, proof that anyone could ascend to the highest levels of power, even against the odds of poverty and discrimination. Thomas had spent decades cultivating an image of quiet strength, rarely speaking during oral arguments, letting his votes do the talking. He became known as the silent justice, the one who resisted theatrics. To his admirers, this was discipline. To his critics, it was avoidance. But behind that silence, questions grew louder. It wasn't one scandal, it was a pattern. Lavish vacations, private jets, luxury gifts from wealthy friends, who just so happened to have interest before the court, trips worth more than many Americans would earn in a year, yet never disclosed until investigative reporters pulled back the curtain. He had defended it all as friendship, as normal, as nothing to see. But the optics were undeniable. How could the nation's highest arbiter of justice accept favors without strings? The answer was obvious. He couldn't, not without eroding the very trust that bound the court to the people. And yet, Thomas carried himself as though untouchable. Each revelation slid off his back with the same dismissive air. He leaned on the shield of lifetime appointment, on the tradition that Supreme Court justices stood above politics, beyond scrutiny. But scrutiny found him anyway. And the irony was almost poetic. For decades, Thomas had avoided speaking, choosing silence as his shield. But in this chamber, it was Jasmine Crockett's words that filled the air, rewriting his legacy in front of the world. He could smirk, he could shrug, he could pretend the accusations meant nothing. But the weight of history was against him now. His silence would no longer protect him, because the very flaws that had built his image would soon trigger his downfall. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stood in that chamber, staring down Clarence Thomas, she was already a fighter. Not the kind crowned by privilege, not the kind born into wealth or legacy, but the kind molded by struggle, sharpened by necessity, and fueled by a relentless belief that silence was never an option. Her story began in Texas, a state where the battles for justice were often uphill and unrelenting. She grew up with the lessons of hard work, family, and the knowledge that nothing would ever simply be handed to her. For Jasmine, identity was not just a personal marker, it was a banner she carried proudly, even when the world told her to lower it. Law became her weapon. She studied, she argued, she learned to cut through the noise with precision. But unlike so many who saw the law as an instrument of power, Crockett saw it as a shield for the vulnerable, a megaphone for the voiceless. Her early career was marked by representing those who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, people who had been written off as invisible. Each case taught her that the system was rigged, that justice didn't always mean fairness, and yet she persisted. As Crockett spoke, it wasn't just her voice echoing in the chamber. It was the voices of generations behind her, the mothers who taught her resilience. For Thomas, the confrontation was an inconvenience, another critic to outlast. For Crockett, it was destiny, and she leaned into that destiny with the calm of someone who knew her entire life had been leading here. Because when she looked at Clarence Thomas, she didn't see an institution. She saw a man who could be challenged, a man who could falter, a man who could fall. Her story gave her the strength to stand taller than his title, to pierce through the armor of privilege with nothing more than truth. And in this moment, everything she had fought for was about to collide with everything he represented. The chamber was no longer quiet. There was a buzz now, low murmurs, shuffling, the kind of restless energy that spreads when everyone knows they are watching history unfold. Jasmine Crockett sat unshaken at the center of it, her focus fixed, her questions ready. Clarence Thomas, for the first time in years, found himself under a microscope he could not control. Her first line of questioning had cut deep, but what followed was sharper still. Crockett did not shout. She did not grandstand. She let the weight of her words do the work. Each inquiry was crafted with precision, leaving Thomas less room to maneuver. "Justice Thomas," she pressed, "when a judge accepts gifts, lavish gifts, undisclosed, do you believe that strengthens or weakens the public's trust in the court?" Thomas shifted, his hand brushing his chin as though buying time. He gave a half smile, the kind that used to disarm critics, but it faltered under the intensity of her stare. "Gifts from friends," he said finally, voice low. "Personal relationships?" But Crockett pounced before he could finish. "Personal? When those same friends have business before the court? When those same friends benefit from the rulings you help shape? Forgive me, Justice, but that sounds less like friendship and more like influence." Thomas tried to reclaim his composure, but each attempt left him more exposed. Crockett's calm contrasted with his growing defensiveness, and in that contrast, the story told itself. Hero versus villain, integrity versus arrogance, dignity versus corruption. And then, just as it seemed Thomas might find footing, Crockett leaned in once more, her voice steady, her words precise. "One final question, Justice," she said, her tone cutting through the noise. "If accountability doesn't apply to you, then what hope do ordinary Americans have for justice at all?" The chamber froze. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. And with that, the confrontation reached the point of no return. The silence after Crockett's final question was unlike any silence before it. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, it was the weight of truth. Pressing down on every corner of the chamber, reporters froze mid-sentence, aides exchanged glances. Even the gavel, which moments earlier had slammed frantically for order, now rested idle, its authority suddenly irrelevant. Clarence Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. His lips parted, then closed, then parted again, as though searching for a lifeline in waters where none existed. The mask of superiority, so carefully worn for decades, began to crack before an audience that would never forget. And then Jasmine Crockett struck. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean on theatrics. Instead, she let the stillness stretch until the tension became unbearable, until the audience was practically begging for the release of her next line. "Justice Thomas," she said softly, almost tenderly, "do you understand what it looks like when the very man entrusted to uphold our highest ideals treats justice as a luxury, one, reserved for those who can afford it?" A murmur rippled through the chamber. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Crockett wasn't just addressing Thomas. She was addressing every American watching, every citizen who had felt the sting of a system tilted against them. Thomas tried again, his voice catching on the edge of denial. "Congresswoman, with respect," the eruption this time was unstoppable. Reporters' pens couldn't keep up. Phones lit up across the chamber as staffers texted furiously she just destroyed him. "It's over." And still, Crockett pressed forward, her cadence building into something unforgettable. "Justice Thomas, you have sat in silence for decades, letting rulings speak for you. But silence cannot save you now. Because silence is complicity. Silence is privilege. And silence in the face of corruption is betrayal." It was a mic drop moment, though she hadn't raised her hand or her voice. She simply let the words fall, heavy and undeniable. The kind of words that replay in headlines, in social media clips, in classrooms and family dinners. Thomas sat frozen, unable to mount a defense that wouldn't sound hollow. His smirk was gone, his authority drained. He had been reduced to a man cornered by truth. Thomas, however, sat diminished. No gavel, no robe, no title could restore what had just been stripped from him, the illusion of untouchable authority. And yet, the true shock was not what happened in that chamber, but what followed after. The roar inside the chamber was only the beginning. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the outside world had already begun to ignite. Within minutes, clips of her takedown were spreading across social media like wildfire, carried on the wings of hashtags that wrote themselves #Crockett vs. Thomas, #TruthOverPower, #JusticeForAll. Twitter lit up first, as it always did. Activists shared the clip with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like." College students, many of them first-generation Americans, reposted it with their own stories of struggle. "She spoke for my family today." Even seasoned journalists, people who rarely allowed themselves to sound impressed, typed phrases like historic, devastating, and career-defining. But this wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning. Because once the dust settled, the question lingered, would this be just another viral moment, forgotten in the churn of headlines? Or would it transform into something lasting, something that shifted how Americans saw their leaders, their courts, their democracy itself? The reminder was this: power may feel eternal, but it is never invincible. For years, Clarence Thomas had embodied the notion of untouchable authority. Lifetime appointment, decades of rulings, a wall of deference that made him seem larger than life. But in a single exchange, Crockett reminded America that no man, no matter how powerful, is beyond accountability. She showed that the people's voice, when carried with conviction, can rattle even the most fortified walls. And that mattered, not just for the politics of the moment, but for the values of the country, because Crockett's confrontation wasn't simply about ethics, reports, or billionaire gifts. It was about dignity. But just as the country began to take in the lesson, just as the applause began to settle into reflection, another question loomed. What would Crockett do with this moment? Would she carry it into future battles? Would she rise even higher, taking the fight for dignity onto an even larger stage? The answer, whispered in the hearts of those watching, was almost too thrilling to imagine. The moment Jasmine Crockett faced down Clarence. Thomas will live far beyond the chamber where it happened. It wasn't just a clash between two figures. It was a collision of two visions of America, one clinging to privilege, secrecy, and silence, the other daring to demand accountability, dignity, and truth. And in that collision, a choice emerged for all of us. Do we accept a system where power shields itself from responsibility? Or do we believe, like Crockett showed us, that courage can still cut through corruption? That's why this story matters. Not because of the headlines or the hashtags, but because of what it proves. Justice isn't abstract. Justice lives in the voices willing to rise, the hands willing to write, the people willing to refuse silence. You've watched what happens when one person speaks up. Now imagine what could happen if millions did the same. Imagine if instead of despairing, we leaned into the fight, if we believed that America's promise belongs to all of us, not just the powerful few. So let this moment be more than a viral clip. Let it be a call to speak up in your own life, to hold the powerful accountable, to demand fairness no matter the odds. And if you believe in that fight, if you believe in truth over arrogance, dignity over corruption, then join this movement. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to the millions who refuse to be silent. Because the lesson of Jasmine Crockett versus Clarence Thomas is simple. Power only wins when people give up. And tonight we've been reminded, loudly, clearly, that we are not giving up.